said, I'm an immunologist, and I spend most of my time thinking about how a cell, I'll show you exactly where it fits in, but how one of our white blood cells helps us to stay healthy, and how we can kind of reprogram or repurpose those cells or just reinvigorate them to help us to cure disease. One of the diseases that I care very deeply about is cancer, and in particular pancreatic cancer. So in my lab, when we're not in the throes of a pandemic, I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to train the immune system to help us to cure pancreatic cancer and keep it from coming back. And so this little guy up here, this ninja, that's my natural killer cell, that's my little pet. And it goes after and tries to kill things that look just unwell and unright. But these cells probably didn't evolve to help us against cancer. They probably evolved to help us against things like virus infections. And so one of the other things that we occasionally think about is how they fit into the antiviral immune response, which is how I've been sort of called up into the coronavirus world in the last couple of months. But as I'm talking and as I'm going through here, a lot of the lessons that we're seeing in coronavirus actually really just reflect how the immune system works in general, and can be applied across the board. The real challenge of coronavirus is that it's one of the sneakiest, most terrible kinds of things that we're going to see in our lifetime, and the most challenging things for our immune system. And with that, comes a lot of parallels with the cancer program. So I thought what I would do is start by walking you through a little bit how we got here, where this virus has come from. So coronaviruses are just a group of viruses. They're what we call a family. So within our family of coronaviruses are other viruses that are very similar and related. So we all remember SARS from Toronto back in the early 2000s. There's another one you may have heard of called Middle Eastern respiratory virus. That's another coronavirus that we probably got from camels. And then there's this whole array of what I call garden variety coronaviruses. They might be a problem in certain animals, but in people, you would get a common cold-like illness and you would shrug it off. In fact, your doctor would never even bother testing you because he would just say, go home, take a few days off, you're going to be fine. So we're still working on where our coronavirus or our SARS-CoV-2 has come from this time around. We know that it spent some time in bats, and it probably originally came from bats. And then it probably evolved an ability to infect some other type of animal. And what that animal is still an open question in the scientific field. They think it might be pangolins, which are sort of this like rodent armadillo-like thing you can Google later. But the likelihood is that it jumped from bats into one of these secondary hosts, and then from those secondary hosts into people in a market in Wuhan, China. And if you look at these markets, what typically happens is all of the farmers come and they bring their live animals, their live chickens and livestock and whatever they're trying to sell. And for the whole day, they spend their time in close proximity with other farmers who are also trying to sell live animals. And if they sell them, then the animals get slaughtered and used. But if they don't sell them, they take all their animals back home to their farms. And so over and over again, these animals are exposed and come back and expose each other, and then they're exposed and back and forth. And so you see, this is a very rare event that something like this would happen, but it has plenty of opportunity to happen. And this one happened in Wuhan, but it could have happened anywhere in the world that these open air markets exist. So that's probably how we got this thing. It's been circulating in the bat population for a long time. People who study viruses have known about this virus for a long time, but there's hundreds of viruses and we don't know which one's going to make the jump. So we don't even know what to be afraid of. So the virus itself is called SARS-CoV-2, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus version 2. V1 was the original SARS. And the disease that it causes is called COVID-19. So just like the HIV virus causes AIDS, SARS-CoV-2 causes COVID-19. So we have lots of coronaviruses. Some of them just give us a cold. Why is this one so bad? Why is this one destroying our world right now? Well, this one's so bad because nobody has seen it before. Nobody is immune to this virus. And so this virus is allowed to just run like a kid in a candy store without a leash on it, touching everything and touching everybody because there's nothing in place to stop it. If this were something like a cold virus, or an adenovirus, or maybe even the one that causes the chicken pox, there'd be plenty of people in the population that could protect us and shield us, and at least the virus wouldn't tear through the population. But right now, there's nothing to stop it. Layered right on top of that is that it's super contagious. So every different virus has a different, what we call an R0 value, or the average number of people that virus can infect every time it infects a person. The higher that number, the badder the virus is. So a low R0 value, something like 0 or 0.5, and the virus doesn't spread very quickly. The higher you get, the worse that gets. And so our R0 value for COVID-19 is about a 4. That puts it in the leagues of smallpox and ahead of things like Ebola and the 1918 Spanish flu, which we all know were terrible. So that's highly contagious. It's what I call sneaky contagious, because it moves around in the population without you noticing, and it gets itself spread around before you even know that it's there. So I want you to keep in mind that a virus is not alive and a virus can't move itself. It's a dead end for a virus if it can't get to a host. And that's why we talk about social distancing so much. So if a virus is going to be really good at moving through a population, it has to convince its hosts to let it around. And the tactic that this virus has taken is to move around before people know that it's there. So the most contagious people are the people who have not yet presented with symptoms, and children. So kids don't get really sick with this virus in general, but kids can carry it really, really well. I have a daughter in daycare, and I can tell you I get sick with a new cold every week when she's in daycare, because they're so good at putting their fingers in their mouths and touching everything and not blowing their noses, that this virus is so clever for traveling around on children. So totally contagious, nobody's immune, and it's really, really, really persistent. So viruses aren't really alive because they need a host to keep them alive. They kind of exist in these little packages. In the case of this, we call it an envelope. And in those envelopes, you can think of it almost like a little soap bubble. But instead of popping as soon as it hits the surface, it can stay on the surface that it's landed on for days, depending on what that surface is. So even if you walk into a space where a coronavirus infected person has been coughing, and you don't realize they've been there, maybe they've coughed on that counter or that table or that package of macaroni, and it could still be infectious. You touch the package, get it on your hands, and then you touch your face, and now you've spread it to yourself, not even knowing where it's come from. And that's how this can move around in the community without us even noticing it. So this is like the perfect storm of a virus for something to move around the population. And this is why it's really important that while we're working on getting a vaccine, and while we're around people who are vulnerable or people who are undergoing cancer treatment, that we're really, really, really vigilant about not letting it move around. The good news is one of the best things that we have for dissociating those soap bubbles is actually more soap bubbles. So the same way, you know, if you crash 2 soap bubbles together, you get one bigger soap bubble. If you crash enough of those together, you can actually break down the virus until it's not infectious anymore. So wash your hands often, wash your surfaces often, wash your groceries often. And if you can do something I call quarantining my groceries. So I've had a bag of flour in the trunk of my car for a week because I don't need it yet. So I'm leaving it there, hoping that all the viruses will just desiccate themselves. Okay, so that's the bad news. We've got this virus. The good news is that in Canada, we're actually doing a pretty good job of flattening the curve. So I pulled this off of one of my favorite websites this morning that's keeping track of all the cases. And so all the active cases are orange. All the people who have gotten sick, tested positive, and recovered are blue. And the people that have unfortunately passed away in Canada are gray. What you ultimately want is for these blue bars to outweigh these orange bars. And we're at about 1/3 right now, and that's actually pretty good. But when this all resolves, you're going to see these orange bars disappear. These blue bars are going to be as tall as the orange bars, and hopefully these gray bars don't get too big. If you have too many cases and the health system can't handle it, that's when you start seeing more mortality and more spread of the virus. So Canada is actually doing pretty good. We have to keep doing what we're doing, but we're doing pretty good. All right, so I'm an immunologist. I wanted to talk you through a little bit of what's supposed to happen when you get infected with a virus. Now, everybody knows that viruses infect different people differently. If you live with other people or you've had the pleasure of having the same cold as somebody else, you've probably noticed that it doesn't present the same way in every person. We love to talk about the so-called man cold, where a man seems to get it way worse than his wife. and it can be the same thing causing it. So I want to really stress that it doesn't cause the same illness in every person, and there's lots of things that underlie that. But in general, this is what happens. There are loads of viruses out in the population. Most of them can't do anything bad to you. But here is our SARS coronavirus. And the first thing it's going to try to do is get into your body. And it gets into the body through the mucous membranes. So your nose, your mouth, and your eyes. And the first thing your body is going to try to do is stop it from getting in there. It's going to stop it from being able to attach and infect the cells in those tissues. That's when you start to get really snotty, you're blowing your nose, you know that you're infected, but it's not terrible yet. If it gets past those barriers, this is when the immune system gets called up. So these cells become infected and they signal to cells of the immune system, hey, there's something going on, I don't feel right. There's a whole bunch of these, what we call innate immune cells, that are floating around in everybody's body, and their job is to respond to these, hey, there's something wrong with me signals, and amplify the immune response. So these cells can do things like they can eat virally infected cells. They can send a signal to virally infected cells to die. They can send signals to other immune cells to tell them something is going on. Now, most of the time, like 99% of the time, a virus infects you, and this first phase, this phase 1 innate immunity, is plenty. It kills the virus, it repairs the damage, and on you go on your merry way. By the time you get to the point where you sort of know you have this cold, your innate immune system has started calling up its reinforcements that take the place of the adaptive immune response. And so here's my favorite cell. There's the natural killer cell, sort of sits at the intersection. And then the really professional adaptive immune cells. These are called T cells and B cells. And they're special because these are the ones that can say, not only is this a virus, this is a coronavirus, or this is SARS-CoV-2, and it can tailor a specific immune response that goes in there like a trained assassin and kills the virus. So the T cell kills any cell that's infected with the virus specifically, and the B cells make these wonderful proteins called antibodies. And antibodies can bind up to the virus itself, and they can neutralize the antibody, or they can tell these innate cells to eat and destroy the virus. If you could design the best thing to have in your immune system against SARS coronavirus, it would be these antibodies, bar none. But the only way that we know of to get those antibodies right now is to make them ourselves. So as this virus is infecting all of your cells and spreading throughout the body, the immune system is trying to keep up with it. The immune system is in a race to try to beat down that virus infection. So it's going to take you about a week to make those antibodies by yourself if you have a healthy immune system. And in the meantime, the virus is still trying to outrun it. So we need to be able to do better. And this is the premise of vaccination, is to train your immune system to make these antibodies before you need them. So how do we approximate this? How do we help the immune system along the way? Well, I already talked about vaccines, so that's an opportunity, but we don't have a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 yet. We're working on it, but we don't have it yet. What we can do though is help to stop, just like a barrier would, to stop that infection. So we can wash our hands and face often. It's more often than you think you should. And we can help with all the barriers. So we can wear masks and gloves to both protect ourselves, but importantly to protect the people around us. So remember, I said you can be infected without noticing it. You can be spreading the virus without noticing it. But if you're wearing a mask, you're much less likely to pass that around to the next people. The other important stuff that's happening in the world of SARS coronavirus is we're starting to ask those questions. Well, okay, we don't know how to make this vaccine yet. We don't know how to train these antibodies, but what if we could take these antibodies out of somebody who has survived the infection and put them into people who are susceptible? So those trials are ongoing. The other trials that are ongoing are what we call antiviral drugs. And so these are drugs that have been invented to fight other virus infections, but maybe we can help to dissociate the virus, cure the virus, and support the immune system so the virus doesn't get out of control so quickly, and the immune system has time to make that antibody response. So we're trying to buy time right now. So those are coming, but they're not quite ready yet. There's about 70 active clinical trials right now, including about 5 vaccine trials that are ongoing, but it'll take a while before we know what works. Okay, so how do we build up immunity? How do we make those antibodies? Well, there's 2 ways to do it. The first is to just get sick and make your immune response, and the second is to have a vaccine. We don't have a vaccine, so we're stuck with option number 1 right now. But that doesn't come without risk. There are so many things that we don't know about what happens after you get infected with coronavirus that the old adage of just get sick, get over it, and make your antibodies is a terrible idea here. So first of all, we don't even know how strong an immune response people are mounting. We don't know how long it lasts. We don't know if people can get reinfected. We don't know if the virus gets cleared or if it might reactivate it. We don't know what the long-term impacts of infection are yet. We don't know how damaging this could be to the lungs, but we do know that if you take a cross-section of people who have been infected, there are people that have had everything from as mild an infection that they didn't even know they had it, to people who have, of course, ended up on ventilators and ultimately passed away from the disease, people who will have permanent lung damage. So as an immunologist, I have to strongly advise against getting infected on purpose. But there are people who have become infected, they've gotten over it, and now they've made antibodies. So they're providing the optimism that you can mount an immune response against it. But it'll take time before we know whether or not that's a really strong, long-lasting immune response. And as people who are caring for people with pancreatic cancer, it's really, really important that not only do we protect the patients with cancer, but that we protect ourselves from becoming infected, because we don't want to be passing that along to people with cancer, because they do have a weakened immune system and they're probably less likely to be able to mount a really strong immune response. So let's talk about that for a sec. So why is it that patients with cancer are more susceptible and vulnerable to coronavirus? And the answer to this is really the same as any other virus. It's because their immune system isn't as strong as it would be if they didn't have cancer. So as we all know, cancer is a disease where cells have mutated, they've gotten out of control, and they're proliferating too quickly. So normally, to refresh the body, we turn over cells and we have healthy cells coming in to replace old cells. But in cancer, that's happening too quickly, and you get this accumulation of a tumor, which is just too many cells proliferating too fast. So most of the treatments that we have, and especially the treatments that we have for pancreatic cancer, just involve trying to slow that down to try to prevent the cells from growing too fast. But if you're trying to mount an immune response, exactly what you're trying to do is tell the immune system to proliferate the cells really quickly. So if you're actively on drugs or radiation treatment that are trying to stop cells from growing too fast, you've actually subverted the immune system from being able to do its job, right? So it's harder for a person who's on cancer therapy to be able to mount an immune response for that reason. The second part of it is that cancer in and of itself impacts the immune system. If things are going well, the immune system actually does a really good job of stopping cells that could become tumors before they become tumors. And so cancer by itself has actually suppressed the immune function to a level that's lower than sort of steady state what people would have. So in general, patients with cancer are more susceptible to A, becoming infected, and B, having a severe disease. So it's really important that we protect people with cancer by sort of keeping them away from the exposures at this point and ultimately developing shields of immunity around them. Okay, so how do we do that? The most important thing that we can do is prevent infection. So we hear about social distancing, and this is really, really important. So we want to isolate the person who is most vulnerable and protect them from becoming infected. So the people that do have cancer should never, ever, ever come into contact with anybody that might be bringing them their infection. And we want to really limit the people around. I have a 2-year-old and she doesn't have cancer. She's perfectly fine, but I know that she is really susceptible to becoming infected. And I promise you, she has not seen another human being in 5 weeks. Except for me and her dad. But those caregivers also should limit their exposures because you don't want to become a carrier either. So if there's somebody in your life that can run errands for you and drop groceries off at the front door, awesome. And if you do have to go out in the world, then you need to protect yourself by building a shield around yourself. And it doesn't have to be medical grade, but it does have to be something you can take off. So for example, you can take off your jacket in the car, you can pack your groceries in the trunk of your car so that your grocery bags aren't coming into your house and bringing whatever was in the grocery store. And if you think somebody is infected, you can call 811, do not go to the ER where you might be exposed, and tell them right off the top, we're dealing with a patient who is undergoing cancer treatment or has cancer, so that they know to build those shields around you when you come into the clinic to be tested. The second most important thing that we can do is clean, 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 clean. So this is a really strong virus. It's a sneaky jerk of a virus, but it's susceptible to the $1 bottle of soap that you all have in your houses. So wash your hands all the time. Remember that gloves are just a barrier, right? So if you take off your gloves and your gloves have virus on now, your hands can be dirty. So you want to make sure that you're washing your hands. Don't ever touch your face because that's how it gets into you. And if you have to cough, do it into your elbow. Clean all the surfaces, especially the high touch surfaces. Remember, your car keys are super dirty. Your cell phones are super dirty. Clean them frequently with soap. Launder your clothes lots. And wear masks when you can. And masks can be ones that you've made at home. They can be a kerchief tied around your face. But remember that it's not just a matter of protecting yourself from becoming infected. It's a matter of protecting yourself from spewing, spit at people around you. So if you're wearing a mask, then you're protecting the people around you because whatever's in you can't get to them. And remember, just a barrier. So you want to make sure that you're washing your hands and your face often, keeping things really clean around you. There's a lot of doom and gloom. Okay, so what's the long game here? So if we can build up that immunity, here's what's going to happen. So as you move from the left to the right, I think on your screen, these different columns represent different proportions of people in the population who are resistant to infection. So as a population in the world, in Canada, we're somewhere over here right now. We don't have a lot of people that are immune to this virus. What we want to get to is a vaccine or some sort of protection, so somewhere over here. And this black circle here, that represents how many people or how quickly the virus is moving. So I'm just going to play this video for you, and I want you to see how much having multiple people with immunity helps to protect everyone from becoming sick. So when you turn blue, that's good. And when you turn black, that's not good. And so over here in our subsections where nobody's immune, you see the virus is tearing through the population pretty quickly. Some of those people are getting sick and getting better. They're turning blue because they become immune. But over here, where more and more people are immune to the virus, they can't act as those carriers at all. And so the virus can't tear through the population. And all these people who might still be vulnerable to becoming infected never get infected because the virus can't move itself and it can't gain a foothold in the population. So we don't have a virus, we don't have a vaccine, but we do have social distancing right now. I'm going to play you another quick short clip, and this represents two scenarios. The first one is that nobody is vaccinated and nobody spreads themselves out. And the second is how quickly this ping pong ball of a virus can spread itself around if we spread ourselves out. So watch this, this is very cool. Dramatic music. All right, now we spread ourselves out. And nobody gets sick because nobody's around to carry that virus around. So keep doing what you're doing, social distancing, flatten the curve. And I'll leave you with a couple of takeaway messages. So the world is very much working toward having herd immunity, but it's important that we do this safely, either through a vaccine or through something that can promise to get everybody through treatment safely without long-term damage. Remember that people can be totally asymptomatic and still spread around virus, but as caregivers for folks with cancer, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're not being one of those asymptomatic carriers or permitting them into our lives. The virus itself can't move itself around, it needs people. So as long as we don't give it people and we make sure we clean up after it, we can't spread it around. And if you need help, ask for help. There's, I'm sure, lots of resources that Craig's Cause can help out with. I know for a fact that the medical students around here are actually quite keen to do grocery runs and that sort of thing. So feel free to ask for help. With that, that's all I have, but I'm happy to take your questions.